Hi, everyone. We will do a rather abridged Etruscan lecture today to make room for the Greek lecture that you probably have already watched at this point. Goals of today's lecture will be to identify the geographic area of the Etruscan people, examine the possible origins of the Etruscan art and culture, understand how and why the architecture and art of the Etruscans is different from that of the Greeks, and understand the funerary customs of the Etruscans. So, the Etruscans were a culture that resided in the present day Italian peninsula. They dominated the culture that was present there in the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BCE. The Etruscans predated the Roman rule, which we'll get to soon. So they're a powerful culture in this time due to their mining. They mined tin, iron, copper, and silver. This created a 7th century wealth boom that increased demands for art and art objects, right? People have money to spend. They want to create luxurious interiors. They want objects that show their wealth, that show their worth. So they're looking to show this off, really, show off what they've kind of the flourishing time. And so that you'll see here as we go forward, this has them be looking elsewhere, and then also has them looking from within to create art from their own culture. Just showing you again here on a more specified map where in the peninsula, as you can see, the more northern and western part is where the main kind of center of the rule is taking place. So the first Etruscan king is named Tarquinius. He is he rules over Rome. His grandson Tarquinius Suburbus and then his sister Tullia, they end up very power hungry, and they both kill their spouses and then their father to make sure that they could kind of share the rule over Rome. The myth goes that Tullia herself ran over her father with a chariot in a very gruesome way. So there's mythology around the kind of power hungriness there in the family. Those siblings, their rule comes to an end in 509 BCE when the Romans installed the Roman Republic, which eventually leads to their empire. So, the Etruscans, another thing that's important to know about them, they exist at the same time as the Greek Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic period. The Etruscans at this time are more wealthy and more powerful than the Greeks. And as you kind of have an overview here of these kind of, we're mainly kind of jumping into the Archaic, but you can see that there was this kind of early time that starts with that kind of boom we talked about, that wealth boom, that then moves on into these different times that are kind of classified via the Greeks, right? These are the Archaic, the Classical, the Hellenistic. Those are all ways of talking about Greek life and culture. And now we're applying the same thing here to the Etruscans. But again, the Etruscans, despite the Greek output, the Etruscans have some similarities, a lot of differences as well. But they're actually a more wealthy culture at the time. So some goals here. I'm going to move on to this term orientalizing. So this is something you might see, can be kind of a controversial use of that word, but I find it mostly just to be not helpful because it's not very specific. So what we mean here, again, I'm bringing this up, I'm showing you this term, even though I don't love the use of it because I don't feel like it's very specifying what you actually need to know from it. But it's a word you'll see used. So again, when you do your research in your textbook or your intelizing, it's always referring to the East. In our case, we're thinking here the Near East. That's how we're communicating the idea of the East. So the Mesopotamian cultures and their influence. And again, remember when I said just a moment ago, the idea that the culture has become wealthy. They're looking to show that wealth. Well, one way, there's kind of just think of it like taste making. People get really interested in this Mesopotamian style, right? Or this kind of Near Eastern style. So this happens both in Greece and in the Etruscan Empire, and they're looking for ways to, the elites, I should say, or the wealthy classes are looking for ways to promote their luxury, to kind of promote their wealth through getting these luxury items. And they do this through the idea of importing goods and also showing, their culture by interacting with other cultures, kind of influences and going back and forth. But of course, in this case, since they're wanting that look, they're wanting that kind of style and that kind of material, they're trying to use imagery, and their imagery then is applied to their materials, which makes it a little different than some of the materials we saw previously in Mesopotamia. This object, which is called a fibula, which is like a brooch or a pin, you'll notice in the center there the kind of emphasis of the center with those 5 lions. And if you look at them and kind of think you've seen something kind of like that before, you're right. Those are kind of the Eastern style, specifically the kind of Babylon style that we've seen previously, that look very similar to the ones on the Ishtar gates. The Mediterranean cultures and Eastern cultures are in close proximity, so exchanging the ideas and goods, like we just talked about, happens, and then the interest in those specific objects and I shouldn't say objects, I should say subjects, right? So in this case, the lions, but the subjects of whether the meaning in Mesopotamian culture was one thing and different than the Mediterranean cultures, there was just the interest in the subject themselves. So this is kind of a little bit of a deviation or a new time in history where the aesthetics of something is taking over, and not just that kind of religious meaning, right? Not just going, ooh, we want those are on the Ishtar gates, they have this powerful meaning. I just like the look of it. It goes back to that. So this is when this becomes kind of something that is being transferred from culture. Maybe even, perhaps, we don't know, but there's perhaps even, the lack of knowledge between what that means in one culture to another, but just admiring the look, admiring the kind of visual significance of it. So this exact piece was made by using a technique called the repoussé, which is a hammering of metal. There's also something here you can called granulation. And granulation, I want to say zation for some reason, but it's lation, is a type of, it's kind of like a soldering. So you're taking beads of metal and dropping it onto the surface of another metal object, and then that kind of creates the raised areas where you see the relief-like parts here in the middle. The high-quality craftsmanship and materials of this, is another signifier that this is a wealthy culture, right? So we're seeing obviously the gold, we're seeing the granulation, and just taking the time that and the amount of time that takes, the amount of effort that takes, and again the material. If you make a mistake, now you're using more gold, right? So using these kind of materials is another way to show off your wealth. I'm just going to show you, without going into too much detail here, but just show you some more. You can see that the pieces there, especially those two slender circular pieces on the right and left, have that same repose and granulation process. So Etruscan culture was fairly similar to Greece. They have, again, fairly similar religious structures, religious practices, and the gods. As you can see, the list here between the Romans, which we'll get into later, the Greeks and the Etruscans. There's a lot of similar specific gods that are just taking on, for our sake, as being outside of all three cultures, taking on just different names that apply to those same kind of basic structure of the meaning, the god with a specific meaning or specific power. The temples also, as we get into those, so as we kind of start to look at the architecture here, the temples have some similarities and some differences. As we looked back a little bit, I know it was brief, but as we looked at some of that in the Greek lecture, you'll notice here, this is of course a model rendering, but you can look here and see some of those, again, similarities and some of those differences right off the bat. So the Greek influence here in the pitched roof, pendant, Doric style columns. We have a specific name for these here. They're a little different, but just that general shaping, we would still consider that Doric style. However, there is no colonnade surrounding the building, right? As we see in the Greek structures. Also, the Etruscan temples would often sit on a higher raised platform, which you don't see in this image because this is a model, but even more so than this little green raised surface here, the temples in reality were raised up off of a platform, which makes them a bit different from the Greek setup. So the columns, let's talk a little bit about those. The columns are specifically known as Tuscan style, which refers now to the Tuscany in present-day Italy, which at the time was called Etruria, which was the main kind of center of that Etruscan realm in that highlighted part of the map we just looked at. The columns are made of wood, so wood, not marble like the Greeks. The material in general for this temple would have been mainly wood and terracotta, which is a type of clay. So you'll notice that there are no reliefs or triglyphs here. In fact, there's no friezes whatsoever on these temples. So instead there were statuary are placed on top of the roof. So here you can see on the far right and left, kind of in the corners, and then at the very top you can see some statues, right? These would have been terracotta sculptures, sometimes ranging from kind of life size to over life size, so anywhere from 5 feet to 7 or 8 feet tall. And this was kind of the idea of showing the visuals or showing the symbols of figures and narrative and gods. And so kind of, again, if we think high is holy, as we've talked about throughout the course, the concept here is to not have kind of inscription on the side that might be more decorative, but actually to put the most holy part or put the most holy representation at the very top of the temple. As we get into sculpture, okay, we're going to talk a little bit more. You can see those bullet points here. We're going to talk about both the role of women in Etruscan society and specifically how that's different from Greek culture. And also, of course, as we always do, what do those poses mean, right? What are those specifics? So looking here at Apollo. Now remember, if we look back at that guide of the gods and goddesses, Apollo is the Etruscan version of what will be the Greek and Roman Apollo. So same kind of position or same kind of similar narrative of his character. But Here, this is a sculpture that was found on the roof. And I'm going to move right there for a second. So this is the same sculpture. Looks a little different because of the black surrounding, but Apollo, this was found on the Port Ignacio temple, and this temple stands out because a lot of temples after when the Romans took over from the Etruscans, there was a lot of violent takeover and a lot of architecture was ruined in that region. So this temple sticks out because there were a lot of these figures that still remained on the top of that temple. Apollo was the most famously well-preserved of these. But if we look just at the figure itself, just ask you to, there we go. Just ask you to notice kind of what similarities are you seeing that from different cultures, both, of course, look back not long time to the Greek lecture, but also back to previous lectures in previous weeks. What are some of the pose similarities and what are some of the differences that you see? Again, the pose, the face, the expression. To kind of get better at answer this question, let's put it side by side here. So on the left we have a Greek archaic sculpture. On the right we have Apollo, right, which is also archaic, same time. These are made from similar time period. So we can look just in the face for a second. They both have archaic style faces with those kind of bulging eyes and what is known as the archaic smiles. Both cultures prioritize close observation of human anatomy, right? We talk about that so much with the Greeks, but you can tell that the same is true in the Etruscan artists and artistry. Differences begin, though, within this. So even though both are looking close, showing a lot of detail in the figure and the form, what is the main difference in the realism of the one on the right? So I think that starts with literal movement, right? We'll get more into that in just a sec. The sculpture is, the Greek sculpture there on the left is made of marble, just like the temple difference. The same applies to the sculptures, right? The Etruscan is terracotta, which is that low-fired clay. So let's look at the leg position for a second. Some of you may have picked that out already, right? We have that Egyptian influence. We have that left foot forward. So in the Greek version, which again, remember the Greek and the Egyptians are closely related in the Greeks are quite enamored with the Egyptian art and artistry. So the Greeks are picking up on that left foot forward, which still not exactly sure what it all signifies, but it could imply movement. It could be a way to balance the sculpture. But either way, that left foot forward is implying movement, maybe conceptually, but not really perceptually because the figure is so rigid and stiff. Versus the Etruscan sculpture on the right, that figure looks like it might be actually moving, right? There's a lean, the neck is slightly bending forward, the body is in shift, right? It's in motion. There's a momentum to the whole body. So that's what you might call a naturalism of the pose. The statue has a gesture to it. You can see that arm. We can't, obviously the arm is broken off, but even that, there's a arm movement on one arm to the other that looks like it's different versus we have that bilateral symmetry in the Greek sculpture on the left. There's also, if you notice, in between the Etruscan figure's legs, there's a base which connects to some past Greek sculptures, but here in the Archaic period, we lose that base in the Greek sculpture, and again, the Etruscans are holding on to that. Some of that, again, might be to balance that more complicated, complex movement structure that the Etruscans are bringing in. You'll also notice just a very literal difference. The Etruscans sculpture is clothed, as that was the norm for that kind of most Mediterranean cultures at the time. The Greeks stand out for that, as they were, again, obsessed with the body, obsessed with humanity, obsessed with the human form, right? So that's a way that they're kind of emphasizing that, is by stripping away the clothes aspect and saying, we're human, this is the body, see it in full. Okay. So we go back to religion for a second. That always brings us to burial, right? So Etruscans practiced pretty different burial practices than the Greeks. The Etruscans buried their dead in elaborate tombs, as Greeks did not. This is more common, of course, with the Egyptian culture. So despite similar religious beliefs and even sharing similar kind of god structure, they and even general practices, the burial practices remained an outlier. The wealthy buried their dead in these tumuli, and these are the large tombs you're seeing here in front of you. These were very large. They were 130 foot in diameter and then about 50 feet tall. What are they like inside? Well, let's look in. Seeing this is a start to answer that question. So these are, this is a sarcophagus, right? A structure that holds a coffin. We, of course, saw those in ancient Egypt. Here we see an Etruscan couple lounging and having dinner. This was common in Etruscan culture, to eat and to specifically formally eat a meal while you lounged, while you laid down. So the idea of the kind of eating at the table or sitting up is not in the style of the times. We can see in the we've got what is known as the woman on the left, the man on the right. There we can see that the woman specifically, if you look at her right hand, there's that gesture, that universal sign for communication, right? So the hand is up, it's kind of folded. There's specific fingers moving. That's to signify the idea of saying something specific, articulating something in kind of conversation. When we look at the man's hand, his right arm is kind of around her. The hand, it's almost like looks like he might have been holding something, right? Again, that specificity of gesture is supposed to be, maybe thought, maybe he's responding to her, but either way, there's again a gesture back and forth. So this sculpture is supposed to represent in their gestures the idea of conversation. So if we look at their faces, we see again the archaic faces. And just in general, there's a liveliness. There's a casual approach to life that we see here. And this is very different from archaic Greece, where figures, remember, look very stiff, like we just saw. But another important really difference about this specific sculpture to bring up and to remember here is the inclusion of the genders together in an everyday representation. And of course, also in an equal representation. They're talking back and forth. It's a conversation. Women would never be represented this way in Greece, right? In general, they were segregated from the men and often, in most cases, very oppressed by the men. So Greeks were at least the Greek men who are recorded are horrified by the relative freedom that women are being represented with in Etruscan art. In Egypt, we also see women and men together in certain imagery. Might not be quite as casual, but at least depending on the time. So, here we see a very different social dynamic than the ones the Greeks were experiencing, and the Greeks, just again the Greeks were very well aware of this. So the Greeks saw this, the Greeks took this in, and they were very critical of this in Etruscan art. Here. So if we think about, I'm going to move here, you can see some of the points here I'm just making all aligned with what I just said, but some more points, especially towards the bottom, in the vases, right, that we see. Women are much more serving or subservient in their um, depictions, and again, they're less body, maybe less focus on the humanity then in that way. So less is focused on them as in the importance, the way that the idea of kind of idealizing the body for the men. It's less that way for the women because they're seeing them in that way. They're representing them as less human. In Etruscan culture, not only is that different in the representation, but it's also just in general life. Regularly attending sporting events, speaking in public. Again, the idea that it's welcome for men and women to converse with one another. All these little details are kind of making society much more about the genders having a lot more of a back and forth. So this is kind of a main difference at this point of a social dynamic. One good difference or specific difference even is when a soldier was honored for an award, maybe after battle, they would bring on the parents as an honoree. In Etruscan culture, it was both parents, so the mother and the father were kind of acknowledged. Again, maybe even asked to speak on behalf of their child. So it is just another way of looking at how the cultures were quite different. Now, if we actually go inside and take a look inside the tombs here, you'll notice the rock formation, right? That they're all kind of made from, or they're kind of the stone-looking makeup of everything. So that's actually made from an Italian volcanic rock called tufa, tufu rather. And it's this is what makes up the rock. This is what makes up rather the kind of furniture and the inlay there. And another thing you'll notice as you look at the structure, the more you look at it, is it looks very domestic, looks very homey in a way. The Etruscans are similar to the Egyptians, that they believed in their afterlives that you should have to prepare for your afterlife while you're alive. Just like, how the Egyptians treated their tombs, the Egyptians did it more like a kind of storage rooms where they created bounty, they collected bounty, and they put those in there with the idea that, hey, we're preparing the dead, now the dead can do with us what they need. The Etruscan tombs were not designed quite like that, right? They didn't kind of have this bounty idea, but instead they were designed literally like houses. So they had it all set up so that the dead could literally kind of move through space just like they do when they are living. So they had furniture, they had kitchens, they had beds. These elements were either made by that tofa or terracotta over top of the tofa. Here is a plan so you can see that the terracotta statues would have been on those two what look like chairs here on the right and left of the doorway. If we look here at a floor plan of one of the tombs, it looks like if you're on if you're on an apartment website looking at different kind of layouts of an apartment, right? It's the same thing we have on the bottom left and right, bedrooms, right? Where the literal rectangles of beds where they would fit. In the middle, we have, again, beds on the outside. We have the chairs. So it's kind of like looking at a spread of rooms. And this was how they designed it. If we look here, this is an interior. This one's called the Tomb of Reliefs. It's in Triviteri. It's about 50 miles away from Rome. So here you can see a lot of details of domestic objects. If we look at the pillar on the left here, we can see you can see a vessel at the top, right? So something maybe for the kitchen, a cooking instrument. We see tools beneath it, some rope. Underneath that, we even see a house cat, right? So everything that's kind of put up on the wall, immortalized, is just kind of everyday general objects. So this is going to be hard to pick up, but on the very back wall, very all the way back there, we have a hybrid looking animal. It's actually not a hybrid in this case, but it's a three-headed dog. Okay, its name is Cerilius, and it's the idea that this dog will guard the gates of the afterlife. So in this case, it's again an allusion to a religious belief that is something that's common in both Etruscan and Greek beliefs, despite the Greeks not having the same kind of setup. So as we move on in time, I'm going to look at some tombs as we go forward and see how they are the same or how they are different. So here is a tomb, an interior from the tomb called the Tomb of Leopards, and this is a painting, right? This is a fresco, which is a type of wall painting. So frescoes are wall paintings that we have seen in this kind of in the Italian Mediterranean since the Minoans, right? That they had those and they were making those, but the Etruscans have frescoes, and interestingly enough, not something the Greeks had the technology or knew how to do at this time. So they just hadn't come up with that technology, or despite despite the Minoan influence on them as well. The leopards are positioned in this piece, as we can see in the kind of very top back, that trapezoidal space there on the back. They're positioned in a heraldic stance, and once again we have a lively scene, right, being depicted in the figures below. You'll notice both men and women in this kind of party scene. Men have darker skin and women have lighter ones. This is a visual technique that again dates back to those ancient Minoans as a way to kind of just specifically quickly signify the difference in the genders. Lots of gesturing with their hands, character. There's a lot of character to these figures in their expressions, which goes again with the Etruscan style or the Etruscan way. Here's some more specific details about the scene. I'm going to move on now to, there's this fresco, another fresco in a tomb in Tarquinia. We see two people standing on either side of this. If we look directly back, we see this kind of door painted on, and we have two people on either side of the door, gesturing in their hands, waving with their hands, and then what was a common greeting with those hands on the head. On the right side of the wall, we see, if we look in the middle, we see two wrestlers kind of creating a symmetry there. They are nude wrestling, just like the Greek athletes performed in the nude. This wall seems to have a sporting theme in general, except for the far left side of that wall. So basically in the corner there, you'll see three figures. I'm going to zoom in here, show you a detail of those three figures. So the figure the figure with the red cloak there, kind of gesturing to his right, he would have been the dead. And the figure on the right, gesturing in the opposite direction, you see he's holding a crooked staff. That figure is a priest, which is, if we go back here for a sec, you can see it on the bottom in the description. It's called the Tomb of Augurs, right? This here, the priest that is holding that crooked staff, is the name for that priest would be an augur. So that's a type of priest, and we can tell that by the type of staff he is holding. Below both of those figures, so the figure that's representing the dead, and then the priest, we see a figure wearing all black that's kind of looks sad, right? Look kind of hunched and folded in, holding their head down. That is supposed to represent a mourner, right? Someone mourning the person, the specific person who has died there, and the right who's standing over them. On the far right, so if I go back once more again, we have the two wrestlers. On the right side of those wrestlers, I'm going to show you a detail of what we're seeing there. So here we have an image of a man holding ropes that bind another man covered by a cloth over his head, who is being mauled seemingly by a dog. This was supposed to be a part of a kind of blood sport, so representation of blood sport. You can see the man with a cloth in his head. If you look at his right hand, I know it's kind of hard to see, or I'm sorry, yep, his right hand, that is his right hand, has a club, right? Has kind of a big, gnarly looking club, and that is kind of terrifying as it is the idea that he is kind of being, blinded by the cloth, but is trying to club this dog, and the dog is, of course, in response, is going to kind of try to bite up and maul him. So this is the idea. This is maybe one of the possible, just like the Romans, who will come, we'll talk about later, this idea of blood sport, right? People kind of gathering to watch dangerous and kind of tense, horrifying entertainment. So this is an example being kind of shown in the fresco here. If we look at the next fresco, we see more men and women side by side. If we look at the bottom, you see a pattern of waves at the bottom. I know it's broken up, but hopefully you can kind of tell by the repetition of form there. And then also you can notice the motif of the checkerboards, right, on the top right and left, and then in the middle we have another kind of abstract, could be loosely based on some sort of like berry design, like some sort of vine with berries on it. But we have, again, just a geometric design. These are, again, familiar to Minoan art, this idea of this kind of repetitive motif. So that's already 1,000 years old at this point, but you can see that it's still very present in the visuals and the looks of what the Etruscans are going for. There is interest in general when I brought up those kind of the idea of the vines or this or that, and again, the water. I'm going to go to another image, and you can see, hopefully, again, there's this general interest in nature, the images of flora and fauna. Notice also the use of color here. It's a lot more, we've got a mix of cools and warms, right, with the blues and then the yellows and reds. We have a figure kind of diving into what we know must be the water. If we go back just a sec, going back to those motifs and then seeing this idea of flora and fauna, just keep in mind, we've been talking about the figures and the realism of figures today, both in the Greeks and, of course, in the Etruscans. Just take in this idea that how the representation of nature is. Is it real? Is it more symbolic? So kind of take that in as just an idea in contrast to the figures, or in contrast to how we've also thought about that general balance before. As we move on, Etruscans were not just, masters of terracotta, but also they had metal, right? They made metal work as well. They were advanced in terms of their metal smithing, and of course I told you they were mining all that metal, so they had plenty of that material, and they've definitely rivaled the Greeks at this point in time. This is a sculpture depicting the myth of the origin of Rome. This creature we're looking at here is known as the Capitoline wolf, which is named after the Capitoline hill. Underneath the wolf, you see those two figures. Those are supposed to represent Romulus and Remus, the two mythological human founders of Rome. And I'll show you just kind of a few funny narrative images there. You see the two babies that are at the very kind of bottom underneath the wolf. So the myth goes that they were abandoned as children in nature, and the wolf raised them. the wolf. If we go back, sorry, one more specific couple illustrations there of Romulus and Remus. Okay. Right. So if we actually look at the metal kind of sculpture here, the wolf has, just like the figures we've been talking about, has a realistic movement to it, a gesture. The face has a liveliness and alertness to the expression. This is called verism, right? The truthfulness of an image. So that term verism is a term we can start using and throwing around, especially to talk about the emotive expression in the wolf's face. And yet there's also this decorative stylization at the very same time. So the realism we see in the subtle detail, in the musculature around the ribs, the downturn, the kind of downturn edges around the edge of the mouth, the stylized fur is where we see the stylistic, right? That where we see kind of something that's a little bit less realistic, where we see it kind of right around the neck and the haunches, right? We can see that kind of almost looks like a metal, like a medieval metal hood that this wolf is wearing, right? Because it's so kind of perfectly repetitive and patterned. And then of course right in here and on the back as well, which contrasts so extremely to this otherwise very realistic expression that we see. For anyone that is, has a pet dog, I mean, it looks just like a certain kind of dog expression. The way the breathing, you can tell in the mouth, and the eyes are looking expectantly and very uniquely as dogs do to kind of communicate based on look and trying to interpret the figures around them, the people around them, the creatures, I should say, around them. So Romulus and Remus, just to kind of finish that story, end up being, right, kind of fighting, and Remus kills Romulus and kind of takes over Rome. And so that it's just important to remind you all that these figures that we see here are actually Renaissance additions. The Etruscan sculpture would have just been the Capitoline wolf. If we look at another bronze sculpture here from the classical period, we see a mix between studied realism and stylization again. So this is a chimera, which I'm sure a lot of you maybe know from different mythologies. They're hybrid creatures. This one's made up of a lion, serpent, and a goat. So these chimeras are fierce and represent a kind of unnatural horror. This is again This is made from a lost wax technique sculpture, and there's a mold created and then a pour, and we have a realistic lean again, right? We look at the body. There's a movement, there's a gesture and a lean to the whole body that looks realistic, careful musculature, and there's even, if we look at the face, just like that Mesopotamian lion we looked at, there's wrinkles, really detailed wrinkles in the nose, right? You notice there's holes. If we go to another image here of it, we see it from the front. There's holes of the eyes. These would have been the eyes themselves would have been made from another material. This would have, of course, only added to the realism, right? To have those kind of eyes, perhaps made out of a type of maybe something that added color to them or lifelike quality to them. But if we go back at the fur from this angle and from this one, we can tell the fur itself is very stylized, right? And given that pattern of that even pattern of tufts there of hair. This object is called cista. It's rather a commonly found object in the tombs of the wealthy. So the cistas held women's toiletries. At the time, we see kind of Greek influence. If we look at the very top, based on that pose, right? That's the kind of contrapposta pose of the figures. The artist uses detailed inscribing all throughout the kind of base and bottom here of the object, the main kind of cylindrical part of the object. And this is made from bronze. This would have originally been made from a solid sheet of bronze that was then curved into a cylinder. We can see another example of that engraving there. It's important to just let you know Etruscans used arcs in their architecture, right? This is something we will see in Rome, but it was established here by the Etruscans first. This is a wall guarding a city called Pigria, and Romans eventually took over Etruscan cities, but and then severely damaged them, like I mentioned earlier when talking about the temples. But Pigria made a deal with Rome, and so some of their architecture ended up surviving. So we have that here. This is a nice example, clearly, of a arch. And as we kind of round this out, I just want to point out another sarcophagus. This tells us how time has changed in the Hellenistic sculpture, right? So we looked before at that sarcophagus from the archaic time, and how everything was kind of much more alive and happy. And here we have something that's very sorrowful. We see this figure on display. Instead of the happy lounging couple, we see one singular sad lounging man. Lars Polyna is his name, and looking into the abyss, right? At the bottom, we see on the bottom register here, we see two figures called sharuns, and they're on either side of what we assume is Lars, and they're kind of swinging heavy hammers to kind of in a very graphic way that we're going to see his death, kind of, right? He's kind of pulverizing him. And then on either side of the sharuns, we see winged figures that, again, in our maybe minds, we would think, oh, we relate to that idea of angels or angelic, but actually these are demons. They're female demons called Vants. So they're from the afterlife, kind of signs of the afterlife. So these sarcophagus lids, just in general, give us insight to how Etruscan culture and life is going. We can see here another sarcophagus lid. We see here the realism, right, of this affectionate couple. So here we have a couple again, but once again, it's a lot more moody, right? It's a different mood, at least, than the one we saw earlier. And we just don't see this at all in Greek art. This kind of, besides the fact of kind of the interaction between people, the interaction between a couple, we don't see this kind of realism and the idea of connecting men and women in this way at all. Notice the detail and precision of the actual cloth, right? Getting that kind of detail of the folds of the sheet that we see there. And I'm going to go to one more image, last but not least, right? We see here a magistrate and a person called Alul Metelli, and he's a civic leader. And by this time, this piece is creation. The Etruscans are fully conquered by the Romans. So now you can see kind of how the fashion changes, the haircut even changes. It looks very Roman. It reminds you of what we're going to see going forward in Roman culture. It maintains the realism of the Etruscan era. And again, we've got those inlay spaces for the eyes, as you can see. So again, that would have been the prominence of realism. But this is now culture changing, culture shifting. And so we'll go more into that coming up. So this wraps up the Etruscans.